I'd like to pick up at least one further thing about the mire of how running black operations, or operations that are not above board, through military channels or funnels, conduits, creates complete confusion. And you had been mentioning being invited to try and help work out the mess that had been created for the families of people who, one way or another, I guess from the 50s or the 60s on, were now missing or declared POWs in Southeast Asia, but that the Army would say, sorry, we have no record of them. And to tell us something about your experience with the wives or the mothers or the brothers or whatever of these people, and how it just created such a confusion that had never existed that way before for the U.S. government.
Yes, we really have to realize that the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War is intended for what we might call civilized societies. That if both sides don't respect the convention, or even more bluntly, if one side is just not able to do it, like one of our enemies, we call them, in Indochina, were the Viet Cong. There was no central administration, no accounting area, no central prison camp. They were the Viet Cong, little men in black pajamas running through the woods, trying to, really bandits, trying to stay alive, trying to eat. And if they had to shoot Americans, they did. If they had to capture an American, they did. But to think there was accountability among those people, or even an awareness of such things as Geneva Convention, is just out of the question. And such things as that snowballed because we had been fighting in Vietnam, or at least supporting warfare there, since September 45 up until 1965. For 20 years, that was what was the Vietnam War, and it was really not a war. We never declared war against Laos, and yet a predominant number of these so-called POWs went down in Laos. They were airmen. The airplanes crashed in Laos because it's smarter to crash in Laos than in North Vietnam. And only a few miles further they could get there, and then if they lose control of the plane, they'd lose it. But Laos, it was not at war with the United States. How are we going to have a POW without a war? So there's a lot of the intricacies of that kind of procedure developed from a war, or from warfare, that started in 45 and went to 65, when all of the operational control was under CIA. Now, if you are an employee of the CIA and operating in another country, by historic definition, you're a spy. You're an agent. You shouldn't be there. And putting a spy up against the wall is the name of the game, to stop him from coming again. So there were not adequate safeguards for the people who worked in Vietnam in that period of time. And although there were a lot of military there, for example, the CIA called me in December 1960 for a squadron of helicopters to be used in Vietnam. Now, a squadron of helicopters doesn't sound like much, but you need the pilots, you need the mechanics, you need the supply men, you need all of the equipment to keep that thing going. Over 500 men. And that's a modest number, because once you get that many men there, there has to be a hospital, a supply, and everything else, place to live. So we had men there. Well, we did what we called sheep dipping. We only took volunteers to work on those arrangements. The volunteers would then be employed by the Central Intelligence Agency at a commercial rate. They made money on the deal. And then we made duplicate records of their military records so they wouldn't lose their seniority in the military. And then we made another set of duplicate records of their civilian records so that, for example, if they were paying payments on a car back home or a mortgage, they could keep that up and keep all the records straight in accordance with the paperwork of their normal lives. That's called sheep dipping. Well, when you put people like that and expose them in a war run by the CIA, the fact that they're military works backwards. If they're lost someday on a helicopter mission, and I don't know how many people realize this, we lost over 5,000 helicopters in Vietnam. Those men are missing. They're not, well, if the wife writes to the Army and says, where's my husband? He's flying helicopters in the Army. I would say we have nobody flying helicopters by that name. We have nobody in Indochina by that name. We're very sorry. We have no records of this whatsoever. And the parents would get no answer. Well, they couldn't understand that situation. And it got worse and worse as we stayed longer in Vietnam, because all of the things that put together the Geneva Convention were not working at all on either side. You see, we were swearing up and down that the men weren't in the Army anymore. They were working for CIA. We were trying to protect the CIA and its activities. We're trying to keep people from being shot as spies and that sort of thing. And yet we thought we could carry things along normally as just operating helicopter squadrons. Well, things don't work that way.
Right.
So by 1970, many of the wives and mothers and fathers of the men who were missing, either POW, or they assumed POW, or just plain missing in action, at least they had not been declared dead, began to get together. And a group in the San Diego area formed just an informal club of about 35 wives. And finally, they got the attention of Washington. And in May of 1970, they agreed to meet in Washington. And as a function of that meeting, they established what they call the League of Families for Americans in Vietnam, American prisoners and missing in Southeast Asia. American prisoners and missing in Southeast Asia. It's interesting to note that they didn't say American soldiers.
Right.
They knew by that time that they weren't dealing with that problem. It was a new thing. Another thing was, this is the first time in our history that the services didn't take full care of the military. Regardless of the sheep dipping and everything else, the service is responsible for the man.
Right.
And yet the services let the League of Families do it. Now, that's the public story. Is that the real story? Well, I can tell you that because of the experience I'd had before I retired, that I received a call from a general's office in the Pentagon suggesting that I be an advisor to an organization that they were putting together to be called the League of Families. I had never heard of it. I was a banker in Washington at the time. I had no idea something like this was being done. But I was asked to do it. I told them I would do it. Sometime in June of 1970, I went to a big party, a big meeting of all these people in the offices of the Retired Officers Association, and met many of these women who had come in from San Diego and other places to start this association. There were many military people there. There were congressmen there. It was quite a meeting. Probably 400 or 500 people were there. And then I got a letter shortly after that from the woman who was the head of the National Committee, and the woman who was the man. They had two sort of national commander, and another one was like commander-in-chief, the two titles anyway. We got a letter from the both of them saying that they needed me to be an advisor on the committee. There was no reference whatsoever to the fact that they had got my name from the Pentagon. It was as though they had dreamed it up. Well, how would they know me from anybody else? And you see, so the Pentagon and this committee were definitely related to each other, and they had common interests. But in between that, on the 28th of May in 1970, this League of Families was incorporated legally as a nonprofit organization in the city of Washington, D.C. It was incorporated by 3 Washington, D.C. residents. I believe that none of them were related to any prisoners of any kind. One of these residents, in writing a letter to me within a week or so after the incorporation, wrote it on stationery that listed him as Vice President and General Counsel of the Reinsurance Association of America. Now that is the cap insurance organization over all insurances.
Wow.
That's the one that handles catastrophes like the crash of a 747 or something like that. And at that time then I realized that insurance was part of this problem. Now just think what happens. If a man is a POW and has not been declared dead, and he has insurance policies, the family receives his pay every month. And from the pay, they take the allotment and pay his insurance policy. So the insurance policy is still, to the company concerned, a profit-making deal. If he's declared dead, they have to pay the family,
right,
and then they have to pay out. And when you consider that 2,600,000 men eventually went to Vietnam, the overhang of that kind of an insurance policy as a prospect in the future was awesome from the point of view of the insurance industry. That's why they were interested in incorporating and forming this League of Families. Yeah. Now, put it another way, many of the men were not POWs. There wasn't any way to define their loss that way, so they were just listed as missing in action. That meant they just couldn't find them. The guys disappeared. Now, when a man is missing in action, the federal government continues to pay his salary at the amount that when he disappeared, and on a scale that is controlled by the government, increase it as though he was promoted in the, well, just think of the years from, we'll say, 1958 to today, the family's still being paid. Well, naturally, we sympathize with the families. But at the same time, the family recognizes reality. If nobody has proved the man is dead, they get the checks every month. And if he is proved dead, they get the insurance. And if they get the checks every month, they pay the insurance policy, so the insurance company is happy. But if he's declared dead, they have to pay the policy. So you see, the families and the insurance company both lose if the man is declared dead. Right. So there's an enormous incentive to not permit the government, to prohibit the government from finding that the man is dead. Now, it's a terrible thing to have to put your sympathetic feelings up against the business aspects of this. But when you're dealing in thousands and thousands of people, you have to be realistic and understand that this was a situation that developed as a result of the method of what we call the Indo-Chinese warfare. It was not a war, even when our troops landed in March of 1965, right, when the Marines landed on the beach at Da Nang in Indochina. Then those Marines were under Marine commanders, and as far as they were concerned, they were in a military campaign. But it wasn't a war. What do they call this thing that Lyndon Johnson had from Congress that got us into the war? The
Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Yeah, even the Gulf. That's a resolution. That's not a declaration of war. So that according to the Geneva Conventions, we still aren't at war. And with all of that kind of complexity, you could see that more and more families are going to be deeply concerned in this situation, and the insurance companies are going to be deeply concerned. By 1976, the U.S. government was paying to the MIA's families, or whoever their beneficiary was, $9 million a year than they would have paid if the men had been declared dead and didn't have to pay it. $9 million. So from all of those angles, you can see what drew this thing together. And it didn't just start from families. I was brought into the thing at the very beginning to be the financial advisor. I was a banker in the city. And as financial advisor, the first paper I ever processed for the advisory board and eventually for the League of Families was a budget for the first year. It was over $1.5 million. Now, where would these few families, most of them, not wealthy, put together that kind of money in the way of donations? Yeah. The $1.5 million came from major sources within the military complex. Boeing, Fairchild, companies like that. We processed the checks. Much of the money came from letter writing campaigns by these organizations that send out 300,000 or 400,000 letters, and then you get the $10 bills in. In fact, they came in such quantity that the League of Families couldn't handle it, and I had to set up a special post office box for our bank to go down there with a truck and bring these letters in, and then we'd open the envelopes and piles of $10 bills and checks and everything else would tumble out. And every day we made an accounting to the League of Families as to what their budget was. They had plenty of money. You see, it isn't at all what we've been reading in the papers about this POW MIA thing. But the government and its approach to that subject exacerbated the situation because they couldn't handle it otherwise. There was no way the Navy could say that a pilot lost on a flight over North Vietnam can just be written off. The family wouldn't permit that.
Right.
And nobody could say that some special forces officers who were last seen on the Ho Chi Minh Trail somewhere in Laos could be written off, even though there's no war with Laos. And without going too far in this, you can see that if you go back to the very beginning of where this started, that it did not start the way the people talk about it today and where the papers talk, and that even today, the really smart thing to do, and really the most justifiable thing to do, would just be to say tomorrow this thing ends, because it's inconceivable that there are people living under this kind of condition, with one exception. There were people whom I know, I could identify one of them to you clearly, who made so much money in illegal transactions in Indochina during the war, from the sale of equipment that was delivered by ship and then disappeared in the night, from drugs, from gold, from money exchange, from things like that, who worked with the Chinese, who worked even with the mafia, that they can't come home. A man that used to work in the office with Lansdale and myself when we worked for the Secretary of Defense merged his interests with a man in Australia to create the Nugan Hand Bank. Nugan died, supposedly a suicide. Hand had never been located by the Australian government, but Hand is alive. Now, the $1 billion disappeared. I don't know how much of the $1 billion he may have kept, maybe 25 cents, maybe the whole billion.